They fought in sold-out arenas. Millions watched them bleed. The UFC became a billion-dollar empire. But when the cage door closed for the last time, some of these warriors walked straight into poverty. We're talking about UFC champions reduced to begging strangers on the internet just to afford medical treatment. Title challengers who died broke and forgotten. Legends who went from stadium pyrotechnics in Japan to gutting fish on Alaskan docks just to survive. The UFC made billions. These fighters got brain damage, painkiller addictions, and GoFundMe links. This is the story the promotion doesn't want you to hear. These are the fighters who gave everything to the sport and got nothing back. Mark Kerr, the smashing machine. Mark Kerr was a genetic freak built for destruction. Two-time UFC tournament champion who absolutely demolished everyone in his path. When he walked into Pride FC in Japan, it was like watching a final boss enter the arena. Pyrotechnics exploding, 50,000 fans screaming, Japanese commentators losing their minds. He was undefeated, unstoppable, and looked like he'd be set for life just from his reputation alone. But here's what nobody tells you about that era of fighting. The paychecks never matched the spectacle. When Kerr's fighting career ended, the big money everyone assumed he had simply didn't exist. Addiction to painkillers took over his life. He wasn't training anymore, he was just trying to make it through each day. From stepping into arenas where crowds chanted his name, to standing in a cheap polo at a car dealership, putting on a fake smile to sell used sedans for rent money. No cameras, no crowd, no glory. Just a legend wearing a name tag that said Mark, while customers who had no idea they were talking to one of the most feared heavyweights in MMA history haggled over a Honda Civic. The UFC moved forward. The sport evolved. Mark Kerr stayed behind, forgotten by the machine that once built highlight reels from his violence. Mark Coleman, the godfather of ground and pound. Mark Coleman didn't just fight in the UFC, he created the blueprint. The original UFC heavyweight champion, the man who brought collegiate wrestling into MMA and invented ground and pound as we know it. Fans treated him like royalty, and when he got inducted into the Hall of Fame, it looked like the perfect ending to a legendary career. But here's the reality. Plaques don't pay medical bills. After Coleman's body finally gave out from decades of punishment, he was limping through life with destroyed hips, barely able to walk. He wasn't living in a mansion or doing commentary gigs. He was living quietly, in constant pain, with no income stream to cover what his body desperately needed. When Coleman required hip surgery just to stand without agony, the company he helped build to $1 billion valuation didn't step up. Instead, fans had to pass around a GoFundMe link on social media. A pioneer of the sport, a Hall of Famer was literally crowdfunding basic medical care from strangers on the internet. His UFC championship belts sit in a display case somewhere. His bank account was empty. That's what being a trailblazer bought him. Historical recognition and a donation page just to walk again. Spencer Fisher, the king of war. Spencer Fisher wasn't a superstar who sold pay-per-views. He was something more important to hardcore fans, a warrior. Every single fight was a war. Blood, grit, back-and-forth violence that had crowds on their feet. He racked up Fight of the Night bonuses and gave fans the kind of battles they'd rewatch for years. He knew he wasn't headlining stadiums, but he fought with everything he had anyway. Pride over paychecks. Today, Spencer Fisher's brain is permanently damaged. He struggles to remember basic moments from his own life. He gets lost walking around his own house. Dizzy spells, confusion, neurological damage that will never heal. For a brief period, the UFC paid him $5,000 a month in assistance. Then, they quietly stopped, citing contractual limitations in legal language that basically translates to, "We don't have to help you anymore." His wife had to quit her job to become his full-time caretaker. She looks after him like he's a wounded veteran from a war that nobody wants to acknowledge. Spencer Fisher gave fans wars they still talk about to this day. Now he spends his days in darkened rooms, body shaking, barely holding on, with no savings and no security. That's what Fight of the Night bonuses bought him. Permanent brain damage and a silent retirement. Goodridge, from Pride legend to forgotten. Gary Big Daddy Goodridge had one of the most iconic looks in early MMA. Massive physique, ice-cold stare, fought absolute killers in both the UFC and Pride. In Japan, fans treated him like a superhero come to life. Fireworks, elaborate entrances, arenas packed with 50,000 screaming fans. He lived at the center of MMA's golden era when the sport felt larger than life. Fast forward to today, Gary Goodridge can barely form complete sentences on some days. He's been diagnosed with dementia pugilistica, which is permanent brain damage caused by repeated head trauma. There's no trust fund, no endorsement deals quietly paying him residuals, just medical bills piling up and memories fading away. This is a man who once stood under fireworks in the Tokyo Dome with an ocean of fans chanting his name. Now, he sits quietly, confused, struggling to remember where he is, surviving on whatever limited assistance he can access. Pride FC had an unlimited budget for spectacle and production value. They had nothing set aside for retirement or long-term care. Gary gave them legendary fights. They gave him brain damage and moved on. Leben, the ultimate fighter who lost everything. Leben exploded onto the scene during the early seasons of The Ultimate Fighter. Red mohawk, wild brawling style, raw, unfiltered emotion. Fans loved him because he fought like he had nothing to lose, throwing bombs with reckless abandon. He earned multiple bonuses, had highlight reel knockouts, fought on major cards. To casual fans, Leben was one of the recognizable faces of the UFC's explosion into mainstream popularity. But when the cameras stopped rolling and the UFC moved on to the next generation, Leben was left in silence. Addiction hit hard. Alcohol, painkillers, a body that was breaking down from years of wars. He admitted in interviews that he blew through every single paycheck, assuming the money and opportunities would always be there. Now he's dealing with serious heart complications, health scares that could end his life, and constant financial instability. He does small coaching gigs at local gyms, teaching beginners the basics, just trying to make rent each month. The man who helped make the UFC a household name now teaches amateurs in small-town gyms, hoping his body holds together long enough to cover bills. His life feels like a long, painful come-down from the adrenaline rush of a career that abandoned him the moment he stopped being useful. Joe Riggs. From televised wars to warehouse shifts, Joe Riggs wasn't a world champion, but real MMA fans knew his name. He fought Nick Diaz, headlined regional shows, stayed relevant across the UFC, Strikeforce, and Bellator. He built a solid reputation as a tough, reliable veteran who always showed up ready for war. When that chapter of his life ended, there were no analyst desk offers, no brand partnerships or commentary gigs waiting. Joe went straight back to warehouse work. Forklifts, manual labor, moving pallets in high-visibility vests for hourly wages. Between shifts, he takes short-notice regional fights for a couple $1,000s just to keep gas in his tank and food on the table. He once stood in televised stare-downs broadcast to millions on cable networks. Now, he clocks in wearing warehouse uniforms, completely invisible to the world he once bled for. No retirement plan, no transition program, just a return to the blue-collar grind like the UFC years never happened. Cody McKenzie. From UFC memes to Alaskan fishing boats, Cody McKenzie wasn't a champion, but he had a cult following. His awkward fighting style and signature guillotine choke, the McKenzie teen, became a meme in the MMA community. He fought on UFC cards, traveled internationally, signed autographs for fans. For a brief window, he was part of the show, part of the circus, living the fighter lifestyle. Then it ended, abruptly, completely. Cody packed his bags, left the sport behind, and went back to Alaska to work on commercial fishing boats, hauling nets in freezing water, hands raw from work, surrounded by fish blood and salt spray. While fans debated his UFC fights on internet forums, Cody was back on a fishing dock, gutting fish in brutal weather conditions, just trying to cover rent and survive. Nobody tells that part of the story. A UFC veteran can go from Las Vegas walkouts to an Alaskan fishing boat in complete obscurity, alone with his thoughts about a career that gave him exposure but never gave him an escape. Hermes Franca, from title contender to nothing. Hermes Franca fought for the UFC lightweight championship, A legitimate title contender with finishing ability and charisma, his name appeared on UFC promotional posters. He stood across from Sean Shirk under the bright lights of a major arena, broadcast to millions of viewers worldwide. Then, everything collapsed. Financial struggles, substance issues, poor decisions in his personal life. Hermes ended up working random odd jobs just to survive, and eventually faced legal trouble that derailed everything. No savings, no backup plan, no infrastructure to catch his fall. His name slowly disappeared from UFC highlight reels as if the promotion wanted to erase him from history. The worst part? Being a title challenger sounds like a dream opportunity. In reality, Hermes Franca walked out of that championship fight closer to poverty than prosperity, with nothing waiting for him when the spotlight moved on. Justin Eilers, from title fight to tragedy. Justin Eilers fought Andrei Arlovski for the UFC Heavyweight Championship, one of the biggest moments a fighter can experience, standing under the brightest lights the sport offers. Commentators hyped it as his chance to change his life forever, to secure his future with one victory. It didn't work out that way. He walked away from that title fight with minimal compensation, no long-term financial stability, and personal issues that began piling up. Without consistent UFC paychecks, his life started to spiral. He drifted between living situations, struggled to find stable work, ended up in increasingly chaotic environments with no safety net to catch him. Eventually, Justin Eilers was shot and killed during a domestic altercation at a house party. A former UFC heavyweight title challenger died broke in a regular house, with no cameras, no tributes, no official acknowledgement from the organization that once promoted him on massive stages. He fought for a world championship under the brightest lights in combat sports, and died like a stranger, forgotten by the industry that used his violence for profit. Shannon Ritch, fighting because he can't afford to stop. Shannon Ritch was never a champion, but his face appeared everywhere. UFC cards, pride events, regional shows across multiple continents. He's documented in over 150 professional fights, the definition of an old-school journeyman who traveled constantly, always ready to step in and fight. Here's the brutal truth. Shannon Ritch still fights. Not because he loves it, not because he's chasing glory, because he literally cannot afford to stop. Well into his 40s, then his 50s, Shannon continues signing on to underground cards, obscure casino events in Mexico, unregulated shows in venues that barely meet safety standards. He walks away with $1,500 to $3,000 per fight, just enough to keep the lights on for another month. Fans watch his old fights with nostalgia, remembering the wild journeyman who fought anyone, anywhere. They don't see him now, lacing up worn-out gloves in locker rooms that smell like stale beer and regret, fighting men half his age just to survive. No retirement, no pension, just an endless loop of violence because stopping means financial collapse. Kevin Lee, the future star who went broke. The UFC marketed Kevin Lee like a future superstar. Big promotional campaigns, main event slots, a title eliminator fight against Tony Ferguson on national television. He wore expensive suits, talked confidently about becoming champion, headlined ESPN cards. Everyone assumed he was building generational wealth. Then injuries happened. The UFC released him. Comeback attempts in other organizations failed, and Kevin Lee admitted something most fighters never say out loud. He blew through hundreds of thousands of dollars, assuming the money would keep getting bigger. It didn't. In a rare moment of brutal honesty, Kevin said publicly, "Financially, I'm lost. No backup plan, no pension system, no financial guidance on what to do when the promotional machine stops calling your name." Fans debate whether Kevin Lee underachieved in his career, whether he had championship potential. Nobody debates whether he left the sport financially secure. He absolutely didn't. Tank Abbott, the original anti-hero with nothing left. Tank Abbott was the UFC's original outlaw. Street brawler persona, wild knockout power, heavy metal walkouts, beer-drinking tough guy image. Fans loved him because he felt real, not like a polished corporate athlete. He helped sell the UFC during its underground era, when the sport was banned in most states and fighting for survival. Today, Tank Abbott needs a liver transplant and had to rely on GoFundMe donations from fans to afford medical treatment. His body is failing from decades of fighting and hard living. In his own words, bitter and defeated, Tank said, "The UFC made millions off us. We got nothing. They got rich. We got brain damage." The crowds used to chant his name in packed arenas. Now he sits in a chair, body weakened, waiting on donations from strangers on the internet just to stay alive. The sport he helped build moved on without ever looking back, leaving him behind to fend for himself with no support system and no safety net. If you found this video eye-opening, hit that like button and subscribe to MMA Whiteboard for more deep dives into the stories behind the sport. Drop a comment below telling us which fighter's story shocked you the most, or if there are other forgotten warriors you think deserve to have their story told. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.